The air in the archive basement was stale, thick with the scent of paper that had long since yellowed and bindings that had surrendered to time. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows over towers of unprocessed crates. Lila Morgan moved quietly between them, her fingers brushing dust from labels written in spidery ink. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. No one ever sent her down here with urgent orders. The others in the department joked she was the ghost of the archives, always unseen, her work unremarkable. She didn't mind. Silence was her ally. The less attention she drew, the more freedom she had to follow her own curiosities. And tonight, her curiosity had brought her to the farthest corner, where a stack of unlabeled crates sat, untouched. One box, shoved almost deliberately behind a broken cabinet, caught her eye. Its wood was splintered, and the nails along one edge were loose, as if someone had pried it open decades ago. Yet it was still sealed with a thick layer of wax. That alone made her pause. No modern archivist would use wax. She crouched down, tugged the box into the light, and gently ran her fingers over the seal. It bore a faint impression, a falcon in flight, its wings spread wide. Her pulse quickened. The symbol was unmistakable to anyone who had even a passing knowledge of ancient Egypt. Horus, the falcon god, protector of kings. But this was no decorative emblem. The style was archaic, the lines etched with a deliberate hand. With the care of a surgeon, Lila broke the seal and lifted the lid. Inside, swaddled in brittle linen, was a scroll so fragile that it seemed to shiver in the air. The papyrus was darker than most she'd seen, almost amber. The ink faded to brown. She pulled on gloves and laid it on the table. Her eyes scanned the surface. Hieroglyphs danced before her, some clear, others obscured by age. She leaned closer. Her breath caught in her throat. There were phrases she recognized. Son of Ra, eternal throne, protector of the two lands. But then her gaze snagged on a cartouche, a royal name, partially faded, yet legible enough to stir confusion deep within her. She froze. She had studied Egypt's dynastic lists since her university days, memorized them in the way others memorized song lyrics. But this name did not belong to any pharaoh history acknowledged. It was like hearing a familiar melody with a single note out of place. For a moment, the basement felt colder. The hum of the lights faded into the distance. She stared at the name again, whispering it under her breath as though speaking it might make it vanish. But it did not vanish. It was here, inscribed in ink centuries old, defying every official record. She sat back, heart pounding. Why had it been hidden in a crate? Why the wax seal? And most pressing, why had this ruler's name been erased from history? A fragment of a memory surfaced. Her former professor, leaning across his desk, warning her about the erased kings, rulers who had been deliberately stricken from monuments and records by their enemies. "If you ever find one," he'd said, "you'll be holding a truth someone once feared more than death itself." She reached for her notebook, her fingers trembling. The ink was dry, the pen dragging across the page, but she didn't stop. The name must be preserved, copied before it could fade further. Every letter was a key, and she was standing at the threshold of a locked door that no one else had dared to open. Upstairs, the clock in the main reading room struck 9. She barely noticed. Down here, time felt irrelevant. Lila's eyes returned to the scroll, tracing the ancient curves and lines as if they were a voice whispering directly to her across millennia. She didn't know it yet, But this discovery would consume her life. It would bring her face to face with scholars who would try to discredit her, politicians who would threaten her, and truths about Egypt's past that had been buried under more than just sand. For now, she only knew that in the shadows of the archive basement,
A forgotten pharaoh had spoken his name for the first time in over 3,000 years, and she was the only one who had heard it. The name pulsed in Lila's mind like a drumbeat she could not silence. She had copied it twice into her notebook, triple-checking each hieroglyph, each symbol's orientation, as though the ink itself might change if she dared to blink. But the truth was fixed. It existed. It had existed long before she had been born, long before any living soul had walked this earth, and yet it was absent from every document, every textbook, every museum plaque she had ever seen. She needed confirmation. Carefully, she unrolled more of the scroll. The papyrus crackled faintly, protesting the movement after centuries of stillness. Her eyes darted along the lines, searching for context. Dates, events, names of neighboring rulers. She found references to the festival of Sed, a ceremonial renewal of the pharaoh's power, and to the dedication of a temple to Isis near the banks of the Nile. And there again the cartouche appeared, bold and defiant, like an unblinking eye. Her hands itched to photograph it, to send an image to one of the few Egyptologists she trusted. But a colder instinct held her back. Something about the wax seal, the hidden placement of the crate, whispered of intentional concealment, not neglect. Someone, at some point, had wanted this scroll buried in obscurity. If they had gone to such lengths, what might they do if they discovered she had unearthed it? Lila closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She thought back to the library in Cairo, where she had first learned to read hieroglyphs, her mentor's quiet voice urging her to listen to the language as if it were alive. And now, it was alive. This name, this man, was breathing again through her hands. She decided to cross-reference the name in her private database, the one she had built over years of obsessively collecting images of cartouches from tombs, stelae, and scattered artifacts. Her laptop hummed as it booted up, the bluish glow casting strange shadows on the scroll. She typed the name slowly, matching each symbol to its phonetic sound. The search returned no results, not a single image, not even a passing mention in obscure research papers. An unfamiliar unease crept into her chest. It wasn't just that this pharaoh had been erased, it was the completeness of it. The absence was surgical, as if a blade had cut him out of history so cleanly that even the dust had been swept away. She leaned closer to the scroll, letting her eyes trace a passage that followed the second cartouche. The words were fragmentary, but the tone was unmistakable. Royal decrees written in the first person. I restore the waters to the fields. I protect the people from famine. I bring justice to those cast aside. The voice was not that of a tyrant. If anything, it was the opposite, a ruler claiming to lift the lowly, to challenge the corrupt. Her mind reeled. This was no ordinary monarch. This was someone who had likely threatened the entrenched powers of their time, someone dangerous to the wrong people. She jotted notes furiously, the scrape of her pen loud in the basement silence, but then she froze mid-sentence. A memory surfaced, an offhand remark made by Dr. Jameson, the head of the Ancient Civilizations Department, at a faculty dinner years ago. "There are kings who deserve to be forgotten," he had said, swirling wine in his glass. "And then there are those who must be erased to protect the living." At the time, she had dismissed it as academic arrogance. Now it sounded like a warning she had failed to heed. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and for a moment she thought she heard footsteps above. She closed the scroll, her fingers tightening protectively around it. The sound faded, but her heartbeat didn't. Somewhere deep in the back of her mind, a decision had already formed. She would not tell anyone, not yet. Not until she understood who this Pharaoh had been and why his enemies had worked so hard to erase him. The name still lingered on her tongue, heavy and electric, as she whispered it one last time into the empty room, an oath, a promise to bring him back into the light. By morning, the world outside the archives had returned to its usual rhythm, horns blaring in traffic, phones chirping, conversations spilling over cafe tables. But inside Lila's apartment, the air was thick with the scent of papyrus dust and black coffee gone cold. She had stayed awake the entire night, tracing every character on the scroll with her eyes, her mind building a skeleton of the story that had been deliberately buried. The Pharaoh's name appeared more than a dozen times, always surrounded by words that implied reverence, prosperity, and reform. Yet alongside these honors were ominous gaps, sections where the papyrus had been deliberately scraped, erasing entire lines of history. Lila recognized the signs. This was no accident of time. Someone long ago had taken a blade to the scroll. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. The erasures were surgical, precise, and heartbreakingly consistent. Each one appeared at a place where the text seemed to turn political. Alliances mentioned, decrees against corruption, land redistributions. She thought of the rulers who came after, those whose power relied on keeping the Nile's wealth in the hands of the elite. A pharaoh who dared to challenge that would not just be inconvenient, they would be dangerous. Driven by a mix of exhaustion and obsession, Lila pulled a battered reference book from her shelf, The Lost Kings of the Nile. It was an unofficial work, shunned by mainstream scholars for its reliance on oral traditions and half-proven artifacts. Still, the author had hinted at rulers buried twice, once in the tomb and once in memory. She scanned the pages, looking for parallels, but found nothing exact. The name she had uncovered remained unique, unrecorded. As the morning light shifted across the room, she opened her laptop and began searching online archives for any mention of temple dedications to Isis during the time frame suggested by the scroll. That's when she found it. A fragmented stela, housed in a minor museum in Aswan, dismissed as miscellaneous due to its damaged state. But in the blurry photograph, half hidden by cracks, she saw a falcon emblem nearly identical to the wax seal on the crate. Her pulse quickened. If the stela was connected to her scroll, it meant there were still physical traces of this pharaoh's reign. But more importantly, it meant the erasure had not been complete. Lila knew she couldn't just call the museum and ask for a better image. Requests drew attention, and attention was dangerous. She would have to go there herself. She reached for her phone, about to check flights, when a sharp knock rattled her door. She froze. It was too early for visitors. She slid the scroll into a protective tube and tucked it into her satchel before opening the door. A man in his 60s stood there, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit despite the heat. His expression was polite, but his eyes were sharp, assessing her in an instant. "Miss Morgan?" he asked. "Yes?" "I'm Dr. Havelock, from the Department of Antiquities." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. "I hear you've been accessing some of our more private archives." Lila's mouth went dry. She hadn't told anyone about the crate. She hadn't even logged her visit in the database. "I'm conducting a standard audit," he continued smoothly, as if sensing her thoughts. "These basements hold many things that should not be disturbed, sometimes for preservation, sometimes for other reasons." His gaze lingered on her satchel. For a moment she thought he might reach for it, but instead he offered a thin smile. "If you come across anything unusual, I trust you'll notify the proper authorities." She nodded mutely. When he left, the hallway felt colder, as though the walls themselves had absorbed his warning. She closed the door, her heart pounding. It was now painfully clear. She wasn't the only one who knew about the scroll's existence. And whoever else was watching, whether they called themselves scholars, officials, or something else entirely, they didn't want this pharaoh's name spoken aloud again. Lila tightened her grip on the satchel. If she was going to learn the truth, she would have to move fast. The flight to Egypt was booked under a false name, the kind Lila reserved for trips she didn't want appearing on any official record. She told no one, not her colleagues, not her few friends, that she was leaving the country. By the time she landed in Cairo, the weight of the satchel on her shoulder had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She didn't go to Aswan immediately. Instead, she spent 2 days in the capital's quieter libraries, away from the grand, tourist-packed institutions. Here, the older librarians were less inclined to ask questions and more inclined to trade favors for respect. In a dusty back room lined with brass-labeled drawers, she found what she was looking for. Hand-drawn reproductions of temple inscriptions catalogued decades earlier, before some were stolen, destroyed, or lost in relocation. The handwriting on one of the sketches made her pause. It was the same falcon emblem again, this time etched into the architrave of a partially collapsed temple to Isis. Below it, in careful script, was the description: name of ruler obscured by deliberate chisel marks. Lila felt a shiver run down her spine. The erased name had been physically destroyed on the stone, just as it had been on the papyrus. But here was proof that the cartouche had once existed in more than one place. She was still staring at the sketch when a shadow fell over the table. "You're looking in dangerous drawers," a man's voice murmured in accented English. She turned to find an elderly Egyptian man, his weathered hands holding a stack of books. His eyes were sharp, but there was no malice in them. "I'm a researcher," she said carefully. "You're chasing someone," he corrected. "Someone who was meant to be left behind." His gaze dropped to her satchel, as if he could see straight through the leather to the scroll inside. "The one you're looking for. He was betrayed." Lila's chest tightened. "You know the name?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "I knew the story, told by my grandfather. A pharaoh who gave land to the farmers and grain to the hungry. His own brother turned against him. The priests sided with the brother, and the scribes erased the king's name from every wall." He leaned closer. "But a few carried the memory. They called him the giver of the Nile." The phrase sent a chill through her. It matched the tone of the decrees in the scroll, the voice of a ruler who sought justice. She wanted to ask more, but the man shuffled away, disappearing between the shelves before she could stop him. 2 days later, she boarded a train to Aswan. The museum there was modest, its artifacts displayed with more devotion than budget. She walked straight to the wing, holding the neglected stela, its glass case smudged and its label faded. From a distance, it looked like nothing special. Up close, however, the emblem glared at her through centuries of erosion, the falcon in flight, wings spread wide. She lifted her phone to take a picture, but a reflection in the glass made her freeze. Across the room, Dr. Havelock was watching her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he began to cross the floor, his steps unhurried but deliberate. Lila's mind raced. She could not let him see the scroll. Not here, not now. Her hand slipped into her satchel, fingertips brushing the protective tube. A thought struck her. Reckless, but necessary. If the stela was part of the same story, it might also contain something the chisels had missed.
She would need time to examine it. Time Havelock would never willingly give her. When he reached her, his smile was practiced. "Miss Morgan, I had a feeling you'd turn up here." "And I had a feeling you wouldn't be far behind," she replied, forcing calm into her voice. "I think we should talk," he said, gesturing toward the museum's exit. Her eyes lingered on the stela. Somewhere on its battered surface, she felt certain, was another piece of the erased Pharaoh's truth. She just had to find a way to claim it before Havelock took everything away. The meeting with Havelock took place in the museum's small courtyard cafe, shaded by palm trees and the low hum of ceiling fans. It was a place where tourists paused for cold drinks, not where secrets were meant to change hands, but Havelock seemed perfectly comfortable. "I'll be direct," he began, his tone low but not unfriendly. "That scroll you found belongs in state custody. You've had your fun. Now hand it over before you get yourself into something you don't understand." Lila's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "I understand enough to know that you knew about it before I did. You were waiting for someone to find it, weren't you?" His jaw tightened. "Some things are lost for good reason." She met his gaze. "A just ruler overthrown by his own brother isn't a good reason. That's a crime." Havelock didn't flinch, but his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You've been reading, then. Tell me, what happens to a modern country when you prove its most celebrated dynasties were founded on betrayal? That the gods themselves were used to justify a coup?" "That's the truth," Lila countered. "People have a right to know." He studied her for a long moment, then leaned back. "You think truth always sets people free? Sometimes it burns down what little stability they have left." It was clear this conversation was going nowhere. She stood, slinging her satchel over her shoulder. "Then I guess we'll see which one of us gets to the truth first." That night, she returned to the museum, not through the front doors, but through a narrow service entrance she'd noticed earlier. The corridors were dim, echoing with the hum of old air conditioning units. She moved quickly, heart hammering, until she reached the stela's display. Up close, without the glass, the stone told a different story. The falcon emblem was there, yes, but beneath it were faint marks, lines chiseled over but not completely destroyed. She took out her flashlight, angling the beam so that shadows revealed the shallow grooves. Her breath caught. The cartouche was incomplete, but she recognized the curve of the symbols. The name was there, hiding under centuries of defacement. She snapped photographs from multiple angles, careful to record every trace. As she worked, her mind replayed the words of the old man in the library, the giver of the Nile. This was his monument, or at least what remained of it. And if this survived, then somewhere, perhaps in the buried city whispered about in the scroll, there might be more. Her plan formed in fragments. Find the city, find the unbroken records, and make the world hear the Pharaoh's name again. She was packing up when she heard the soft click of a shoe behind her. "Miss Morgan," Havelock's voice said, steady as ever, "breaking and entering will not help your case." She turned slowly. His silhouette was framed by the dim corridor light, his hands in his pockets. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. "You're chasing a ghost," he said. "And if you keep going, you'll wake something far more dangerous than a forgotten king." Lila stepped closer to the stela, keeping it between them. "Then you'd better hope I don't find him." For the first time, Havelock's mask cracked. A flicker of something, fear
maybe, passed across his face. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the stone and the weight of the path she had chosen. 2 weeks later, the desert wind was at Lila's back as she stood on the edge of an excavation site so remote it didn't appear on official maps. It had taken bribes, whispered directions in tea houses, and more than one lie to reach it. The scroll's reference to the city where the sand swallows the sun had led her here, to a low ridge of dunes where a cluster of weathered stone walls jutted up like broken teeth. The camp was makeshift: 2 battered tents, a diesel generator, and a scattering of tools that looked as though they'd been scavenged from 6 failed digs. Her guide, a wiry man named Samir, gestured toward the largest tent. "Inside," he said simply. "What you want is inside." She ducked under the flap, and the air grew cooler. A pit had been dug into the earth, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The walls were lined with faded murals, their pigments muted by time but still vivid enough to make her breath catch. There were scenes of harvests, celebrations, offerings to Isis, and in the center of each panel, the same figure, a tall man wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, his features sharp, his eyes direct. The cartouche beside him was unscarred. Her heart pounded. This was it, the unbroken record. The Pharaoh's name blazed in fresh memory, preserved here as though the chisels of his enemies had never reached this place. But it wasn't just the murals that seized her attention. Near the bottom of the stairs, a block of stone jutted out from the wall, covered in inscriptions. Samir followed her gaze. "We call it the Warning Stone," he said. "My grandfather told me it was cursed." She crouched, tracing the hieroglyphs with gloved fingers. The message was direct. Do not break the harmony of the Nile. To take what belongs to the people is to invite the flood that drowns kings. It was a threat, but also a prophecy, a clear accusation against those who had overthrown him. The scroll's cryptic final passage made sense now. The disaster it hinted at was not metaphorical. It had been real, perhaps even orchestrated by his loyalists in the aftermath of his death. The hairs on her arms rose. This was no mere piece of history, it was political dynamite. If she revealed it, she wouldn't just be telling a story. She would be indicting a dynasty worshipped for millennia. She was about to photograph the stone when she heard the rumble of an engine above. Samir stiffened. "We weren't followed," she said quickly, but his expression told her otherwise. Boots crunched on sand outside the tent. The flap swung open, and Havelock stepped inside, his suit jacket gone, his sleeves rolled up. Behind him, 2 men in desert gear stood with crossed arms. "You just don't know when to stop, do you?" he said, his voice tight with something more than anger. "You knew this was here," she accused. "I knew it was dangerous," he replied. His gaze dropped to the Warning Stone. "That inscription has caused more bloodshed than you can imagine. Every generation that tries to use it ends up in the same grave as your Pharaoh." Lila stood, meeting his eyes. "Maybe it's not the stone that's dangerous. Maybe it's the people who fear what it says." The desert wind howled outside, filling the silence between them. Finally, Havelock sighed, as though the weight of centuries had settled on his shoulders. "You have until dawn," he said. "After that, this place will be sealed again. Decide what matters more, truth or survival." She glanced back at the unscarred cartouche, the face of the Pharaoh staring out from the mural as if daring her to choose wrong. For Lila, the choice was already made. The night in the desert was colder than Lila had expected, the wind cutting through the thin fabric of the tent like a blade.
She sat cross-legged on the floor, the warning stone's photographs glowing faintly on her laptop screen. Her fingers moved quickly, transferring the files to multiple encrypted drives, one hidden in her boot, another disguised as a cheap plastic keychain. Samir kept watch outside, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. Every so often, she saw his head turn sharply, listening for movement. The quiet between them was heavy, filled with the knowledge that they were being given hours, not days. Her plan was simple: make the evidence unkillable. If she could scatter enough copies of the cartouche, the murals, and the warning stone inscription across secure servers and private contacts, the truth could not be erased again, not completely. But for it to have impact, she would have to put her own name to it. Anonymous discoveries vanished into the noise of the internet. This one needed credibility, a face, a voice willing to risk everything. A shadow fell across her laptop. Havelock was standing in the entrance, no longer flanked by his men. "You've decided," he said, reading the certainty in her eyes. "Yes," she replied. "And so have you, I'm guessing." He stepped inside, lowering himself to sit opposite her. For the first time, the practiced smoothness was gone from his expression. He looked older, wearier. "Do you think I haven't tried? 30 years ago, I stood where you're sitting. I touched that stone. I thought I could rewrite history. I lost people I cared about, good people." Lila searched his face, looking for deceit, but what she saw instead was exhaustion and fear that had calcified into caution. "You had the truth," she said quietly, "and you let it die." "I kept it from burning the wrong hands," he shot back. "You think the modern world will cherish this? No, it will weaponize it. Governments will claim the Pharaoh as their own ancestor. Religious factions will twist the prophecy into justification for violence, and the people will just be caught in the middle, like they always are." His words struck her, but they didn't weaken her resolve. "Maybe," she admitted. "But burying it again just means the wrong hand's already won." They stared at each other across the dim space, the desert wind rattling the tent poles like impatient drums. Finally, Havelock reached into his pocket and placed a flash drive on the floor between them. "It's everything I found 30 years ago," he said. "The maps, the stellar fragments, the oral histories. If you're going to do this, at least do it with the whole picture. Don't repeat my mistakes." Lila's throat tightened. She picked up the drive and slipped it into her bag without breaking eye contact. "Then I guess you'll see me in the morning," she said. When dawn came, the site was silent. Samir had packed up the camp. Havelock's men were gone, leaving only the shifting dunes and the broken walls to guard the Pharaoh's memory. Lila stood at the entrance to the staircase one last time, the rising sun painting the stone face of the forgotten ruler in gold. She whispered his name aloud, letting it carry into the open air for the first time in 3 millennia. It felt like a promise she intended to keep. 3 months later, the name of the erased Pharaoh echoed in conference halls, academic journals, and late-night news broadcasts. Lila stood at the podium of the International Archaeological Congress in Geneva, the air heavy with the presence of scholars, journalists, and political envoys who had flown in from across the world. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, each flash freezing her in the act of unsealing history. Behind her, a towering projection displayed the photographs, first the scroll, then the unscarred cartouche from the murals, and finally the warning stone's inscription. Each image landed like a blow. In the front row, Havelock sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but he didn't look away. "This," Lila began, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest, "is the name of a ruler who has been absent from history for over 3,000 years, erased not by time, but by design. His reign was marked by reforms that placed land, grain, and justice in the hands of the people. For this, he was overthrown by his own blood. The room was utterly silent. She took a breath and continued. We know his brother's dynasty. We have built myths around it. But the truth is this: that dynasty was born from treachery, sanctified by falsehood, and maintained by erasure. She advanced to the slide showing the warning stone. Gasps rippled through the audience as she read the inscription aloud in both hieroglyphic translation and English. Do not break the harmony of the Nile. To take what belongs to the people is to invite the flood that drowns kings. Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the stone itself. She could see the shifting reactions, some leaning forward with wonder, others stiff with discomfort.
I know, she said, her gaze sweeping the hall, that truths like this are dangerous. They disrupt narratives, unsettle power, and invite exploitation. But I believe the greater danger lies in silence. Erasure is not preservation, it is surrender. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, not polite, but thunderous, rolling over her like the floodwaters the warning stone had foretold. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond the academic world. Some leaders embraced it, framing the pharaoh as a symbol of justice. Others condemned the discovery, calling it destabilizing propaganda. Archaeological teams scrambled to the desert site, but Lila had ensured that the critical evidence, the scroll, the photographs, the corroborating data, was already secure in multiple archives and with trusted contacts worldwide. In the quiet of her hotel room one evening, she received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single page, a map, annotated in a familiar, steady hand. At the bottom, a note read, "If you must keep going, at least be ready for what you'll find." It was signed simply, H. She smiled faintly, tucking the map into her journal. The pharaoh's story had been told, but there were still pieces of the past waiting to surface. Months later, standing once more in the desert, she found herself at the ruins at dawn, just as she had before. The sun broke over the dunes, and the light touched the carved face of the pharaoh. This time there was no secrecy in her voice when she spoke his name. The wind carried it outward over the sand across the Nile into the world that had finally remembered him. Moral: truth is not a relic to be locked away. It is a living current. It may disrupt, it may divide, but in the end it cleanses, reminding us that the past belongs to no one and to everyone. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.